Imagine a city that breathes with two lungs, a place where you could take a subway from one ideology to another for the price of a single ticket. This was Berlin in the summer of 1961. It was a vibrant, chaotic, and deeply scarred metropolis where the ghosts of the Second World War still lingered in the ruins, but the pulse of the future was beating loud. People worked in the West and slept in the East. They shared Sunday dinners, went to the same cinemas, and fell in love across invisible borders. There was no wall, only a line on a map that most chose to ignore. But beneath this facade of normalcy, a shadow was lengthening. The Soviet machine was grinding its gears, watching as thousands of its citizens fled toward the neon lights of the West every single day. A brain drain was bleeding the East dry, and the Kremlin couldn't stop the wound from festering. Then came the night of August 12th. It was a Saturday. The bars were full, the jazz clubs in West Berlin were smoky and loud, and the families in the East were settling into their beds, perhaps planning a picnic at the Wannsee for the next morning. They had no idea that while they slept, 15,000 East German soldiers, police officers, and factory militias were being mobilized in total radio silence. Codename Operation Rose. At the stroke of midnight, the city's heart was placed on an operating table, and the surgeons were carrying bayonets. The first sign of the apocalypse wasn't a bomb, it was silence. The subways stopped running, the phone lines were cut, the streetlights at the border crossings flickered and died. Then, the sound of heavy diesel engines began to vibrate through the cobblestones. Thousands of trucks laden with concrete posts and coils of jagged Spanish rider barbed wire moved into position. In the darkness, the rhythmic clink, clink, clink of sledgehammers hitting pavement began. It was the sound of a city being amputated. By 2 a.m., the first coils of wire were unrolled. People who lived on the border were awakened not by the sun, but by the sight of soldiers standing in their flower beds, rifles pointed at their windows. They thought it was a drill. They thought it was a temporary blockade. But as the first light of dawn touched the Spree River, the citizens of Berlin looked out their windows and realized the unthinkable. The world they knew was gone. The street they had walked for 20 years was now a border guarded by men ordered to shoot. But the most terrifying question wasn't how they did it. It was how long they had been planning to trap an entire population inside a cage of wire and stone. The air that night was thick, a humid August heat that made the very buildings seem to sweat. In the shadow of the Brandenburg Gate, the smell of diesel exhaust mingled with the metallic scent of fresh barbed wire. There was a surreal quality to the darkness. The east was bathed in the harsh, flickering glare of military floodlights, while the west remained a silhouette of confusion. You could hear the distant barking of guard dogs and the heavy thud of jackboots on the pavement. Every few minutes, the screech of metal against stone echoed through the empty alleys as trucks unloaded their cargo of barriers. To a casual observer, it looked like a massive construction project, but the lack of shouting and the presence of submachine guns told a different story. It was the atmosphere of a prison being built while the inmates were still inside, a silent, efficient, and cold-blooded execution of a city's freedom. As the sun began to rise on Sunday, August 13th, the sheer scale of the betrayal became clear. This wasn't just a fence, it was a 27-mile-long scar running through the heart of the city, and a further 100 miles surrounding West Berlin entirely. The curiosity gap grew into a canyon of despair. People in pajamas stood on their balconies, looking down at the street. They saw the Vopos, the People's Police, standing every few yards, their faces masked by steel helmets, their eyes avoiding the gaze of the people they were supposedly protecting. The confusion was psychological warfare. A man in the east would walk toward his usual bakery, only to find a wall of soldiers. When he asked why, he was met with silence or a barked order to return home. A grandmother in the west would wave to her grandson across the street, only to be pushed back by West Berlin police trying to prevent a riot. The city was in a state of collective shock. This was the conflict escalation in its purest form. First, a lack of information, then the realization of the physical barrier, and finally, the agonizing discovery that families were now split. In the Bernauer Strasse, the situation was particularly grotesque. Here, the sidewalk was in the west, but the apartment buildings were in the east. People realized they could still escape by simply jumping out of their windows. For a few frantic hours, the world watched as mattresses were thrown onto the pavement, and elderly women leaped into the arms of West Berlin firemen. But the East German authorities were quick. They began to board up the windows. They sent masonry teams to brick over the glass. Imagine the horror of being inside your apartment, watching as a bricklayer slowly seals you into darkness, one row of stones at a time, until you can no longer see the sun or your family on the other side. This was the moment the anti-fascist protection rampart, as the Soviets called it, revealed its true face. It wasn't built to keep enemies out. It was built to keep labor in. By noon, the first blood was spilled. A young man tried to swim across the Teltow Canal. The world watched, breathless, as the water rippled around him. But as he reached the halfway point, the sound of a single rifle shot cracked the air. The question was no longer, can we leave, but are they actually going to kill us for trying? The answer would haunt Europe for the next 28 years. If you were there, the first thing you would feel was the texture of the Spanish riders. The barbed wire wasn't smooth. It was covered in hundreds of tiny, razor-sharp needles that snagged on wool coats and tore through skin. The sound was a constant hum of tension, the idling of Soviet T-54 tanks, their engines vibrating the very teeth in your head. The smell was the most haunting, a mixture of wet concrete, stale tobacco from the soldiers' cigarettes, and the iron scent of the river. When you looked across the line, your vision was blurred by the heat haze rising from the asphalt, making the people on the other side look like ghosts shimmering in a dream. It was a sensory overload of forbiddenness, a physical wall that didn't just block your path, but seemed to suck the oxygen out of the air. The vulnerability of Berlin was laid bare in the eyes of its children. There is a famous photograph of a young East German soldier, Konrad Schumann. He was only 19 years old, standing at the corner of Rupinerstrasse and Bernauer Strasse. He was guarding the wire, but he was looking at the crowd in the west. They were shouting at him, "Come over, jump!" You could see the internal war on his face, the fear of his commanders behind him, and the pull of freedom in front of him. In a split second, he dropped his cigarette, unslung his rifle, and leaped over the coils of wire. That image became a symbol of hope, but for every Conrad who jumped, 10,000 others were left behind. The tragedy was in the small details. A wedding was supposed to happen that Sunday. The bride was in the east, the groom in the west. They spent the day standing at the wire, looking at each other through binoculars, weeping. They were separated by 10 feet of dirt and 40 years of ideology. The death strip hadn't been fully cleared yet, so there was still a chance to see one another, but the psychological wall was already higher than any stone. This was vulnerability at its peak, the realization that your life, Your love and your future were now pawns in a game played by men in Moscow and Washington who had never walked these streets. The social fabric of the city began to tear. Friends who had known each other since childhood were now citizens of enemy states. If you were caught waving too enthusiastically to the west, you were marked as a suspect element by the Stasi. The paranoia began to seep into the floorboards. People stopped talking in the hallways of their apartment buildings. They looked at the new wall and didn't see a barrier. They saw a mirror of their own fear. But as the tanks from the east and the west began to face each other at Checkpoint Charlie, the world realized this wasn't just about Berlin. The city had become the detonator for a nuclear bomb. One nervous finger on a trigger, one misunderstood order at the border, and the humid August air would turn into the fire of 1,000 suns. The wall was built to prevent a war, but it almost started the final one. The tempo of the crisis shifted from the frantic chaos of the streets to the cold, slow, deliberate movements of the superpowers. In the White House, John F. Kennedy sat in silence. In the Kremlin, Khrushchev waited. The sentences were short. The stakes were absolute. "A wall is a hell of a lot better than a war," Kennedy famously remarked. The West protested, but they did not move. The tanks moved forward, 1 inch, 2 inches, engines roaring. Then they stopped. The world held its breath for 16 hours. It was a slow-motion dance of death. The tension was so high that a single backfire from a truck could have triggered a global apocalypse. Then, slowly, the Soviet tanks began to reverse. The rhythm of the Cold War had been established, a permanent frozen state of hostility where the wall served as the silent arbiter of peace. As the weeks turned into months, the temporary wire evolved into the modern wall. This is where the story reaches its chilling climax. The East German government realized that people were still trying to find ways under, over, or through. So they created the death strip. This wasn't just a wall, it was a sophisticated killing machine. They cleared the buildings, leaving a wasteland of white sand so that any footprint would be visible. They installed tripwires that fired automatic machine guns. They put in Stalin's grass, beds of steel spikes hidden just beneath the surface to impale anyone who jumped. The climax of this storytelling journey isn't a single battle. It's the realization that the wall had won. The city of Berlin was now a laboratory for human endurance. To look at the wall was to look into a void where the concepts of home and country were erased. Guards were given performance bonuses for shooting border violators. The bravery of the people shifted from open protest to the shadows. They began to dig tunnels, vast oxygen-starved shafts deep under the concrete. They built secret compartments in cars. They even built a hot air balloon out of bed sheets and scraps of nylon. But for every success, there was a Peter Fechter, an 18-year-old boy who tried to climb the wall in 1962. He was shot in the pelvis and fell back into the death strip on the eastern side. For an hour, he lay there, bleeding, screaming for help. Hundreds of people in the West watched, and the guards in the East did nothing. The silence that followed his death was the loudest sound in the history of the Cold War. It was the sound of the world's conscience breaking. The wall would stand for 10,315 days. It would become the most heavily guarded border in human history. But the most shocking part of the story isn't how the wall was built, or even how many people died trying to cross it. The true mystery lies in the secret documents found after the fall, revealing that the night the wall went up, the Soviets had a Plan B that would have erased West Berlin from the map entirely if the West had fired a single shot. What was that plan, and how close did we actually come to the end of history? Today, the Berlin Wall is mostly gone, reduced to colorful chunks of concrete sold in gift shops. But the scars on the human soul remain. The night of August 12, 1961, reminds us that freedom is never more than one night away from being snatched. It reminds us that walls don't just divide land, they divide hearts. If you found this journey through the shadows of the Cold War powerful, help us tell more of these forgotten stories. What would you have done that night? Would you have jumped, or would you have stayed to protect your family? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe to join us as we uncover the next chapter of our shared history. The past is never truly dead, it's just waiting to be retold.